Graham Satchell, BBC News.
Hello, I'm Yalda Hakim. You're watching Impact on BBC World News, and you're watching their coverage of the new Prime Minister Rishi Sunak here in the UK. But let's just bring you up to date on other news now from around the world. Germany is holding an international conference in Berlin to plan Ukraine's post-war reconstruction. Opening the meeting, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz reiterated his commitment to provide massive economic assistance to Kiev. He said Russia's sustained drone attacks represent a new low point in its war. That was German Chancellor Olaf Scholz there. Well, meanwhile, the UN's nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, says its inspectors have regularly visited two sites in Ukraine at the center of Russian claims that Kiev is preparing a so-called dirty bomb, explosives laced with nuclear material. It says the inspectors will return in the coming days following a Ukrainian request. Russia has not offered any evidence for its allegations, which NATO dismisses. Well, let's speak now to our correspondent in Kiev, Hugo Bachega. And Hugo, lots of news going around today, but let's focus on this dirty bomb. A lot of concern there in Ukraine about the use of language from the Russian side when it comes to this so-called dirty bomb. OK, Patrick, we'll have to leave it there, but that's Patrick Bury from the University of Bath. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now stay with us here on Impact. Still to come, 6 Palestinians, including several gunmen, are killed in a major Israeli raid in the occupied West Bank. This is BBC World News. I'm Yalda Hakim. The latest news now. 6 Palestinians have been killed by Israel's security forces in a raid in the occupied West Bank, 5 of them in the city of Nablus. Several of the dead belong to the militant group, the Lion's Den. Israel says that it acted after the killing of a soldier this month. Thousands have attended funerals of the Palestinians killed in the raids. A spokesman for the Palestinian leadership called for international help over the mounting Israeli raids, which it called a war crime. Well, I'm joined now by Yossi Mackelberg, Head of International Relations at Regent's University and an Associate Fellow at Chatham House. Thank you very much, Yossi, for joining us here on the programme. I mean, we have been seeing an escalation of violence over the past couple of months, haven't we? So we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. Do stay with us. Lots more coming up in the next edition of Impact. In the meantime, you can get in touch with me on Twitter. I'm at BBC Yalda Hakim. Don't go anywhere though. Lots more coming up. Hello, this is Impact. I'm Yalda Hakim. Rishi Sunak is formally appointed as Britain's 5th Prime Minister in 6 years, promising to restore stability after mistakes by his predecessor.
I have been elected as leader of my party and your Prime Minister, in part, to fix them. And that work begins immediately.
The UK government is taken to court for allegedly failing to investigate whether imported cotton is made in forced labour camps in China. That's all coming up here on Impact. Welcome back to the programme. Rishi Sunak is in Downing Street for the first time as Britain's Prime Minister after being appointed by King Charles. In a speech setting the tone for his premiership, he said Britain was facing a profound economic crisis and acknowledged that his predecessor Liz Truss had made mistakes. He said he would put economic stability and confidence at the heart of his agenda and that difficult economic decisions would be taken with compassion. That's Britain's new Prime Minister Rishi Sunak speaking there at Downing Street, and we will be speaking to our political correspondent Rob Watson to bring us up to date in the next few minutes. Now, staying here in the UK, and human rights activists are taking the British government to court over what they believe are the importation of cotton goods produced with forced labour in the Chinese province of Xinjiang. That's a province where the Muslim Uyghur minority has been subjected to widespread human rights abuses for many years by the Chinese regime. China denies this. Well, the World Uyghur Congress has initiated this court case together with the Global Legal Action Network, whose director is Dr. Gayrod Okun, who joins us now. Thank you, Doctor, for joining us here on the programme. Just tell us a little bit more about this case. Dr. Gayrod Okun, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. Now, a global poll commissioned by BBC shows the profound and diverse effect that the pandemic has had on mental health. A third of people polled in 30 countries reported that they had lost a close loved one during the pandemic, and nearly half said they were financially worse off. But just over 1 in 3 said they had experienced an improvement in their sense of well-being. The BBC's population correspondent Stephanie Hegarty reports from Vietnam. And you can find a link to the full results for that pandemic poll at the usual place. That's bbc.com/news. Let's just return to the news that 6 Palestinians have been killed by Israel's security forces in a raid in the occupied West Bank, 5 of them in the city of Nablus. I'm joined now by Joel Greenberg from BBC Monitoring, who is live in Jerusalem for us. And Joel, just bring us up to date. What do we know? No, looks like we had a technical issue with that final question with Joel, but that was Joel Greenberg joining me there from Jerusalem. Now, do stay with us. We have lots more coming up in the next edition of Impact, including a special story, a tale of 2 boys, and the play is called The Boy with Two Hearts, coming from Afghanistan. So stay with us. Lots more coming up. This is Impact on BBC World News. I'm Yalda Hakim. Now to an Afghan tale which follows a family's dramatic overland journey from Herat through Europe all the way to the UK. Their escape from Afghanistan is largely motivated by the need to find crucial medical treatment for one of 3 brothers born with a life-threatening cardiac condition. Based on a true story, The Boy with Two Hearts is now a play which is showing here in London at the National Theatre. Well, I'm pleased to say that brothers Hamed and Hessam Amiri, who helped adapt the play from their book, are with me here in the studio. Thank you both for joining us here on the programme. This play and this story really is about humanity and survival.
His children, again, all together, there was that glimmer of hope in his eyes.
Hessam, Hamid, thank you very much for coming here and sharing your story about The Boy with Two Hearts, playing at the National Theatre in London at the moment. And we'll be back with all the latest headlines in the next few minutes. Of course, you can send me your thoughts on Twitter. I'm at BBC Yalda Hakim. See you shortly. Thank you. Hello, this is Impact. I'm Yalda Hakim. Rishi Sunak is formally appointed as Britain's 5th Prime Minister in 6 years, promising to restore stability after mistakes by his predecessor.
I have been elected as leader of my party and your Prime Minister, in part, to fix them. And that work begins immediately.
Liz Truss leaves number 10 as the shortest serving British Prime Minister ever, but defends her vision of lower taxes for the UK. We'll be live in Downing Street assessing the challenges facing the new Prime Minister. Also in the programme, the UN's nuclear watchdog says it will continue to monitor 2 sites at the centre of Russian claims that Ukraine is preparing a so-called dirty bomb. 5 Palestinians, reportedly all gunmen, are killed in a major Israeli raid in the occupied West Bank. That's all coming up here on Impact. Welcome back to the programme. Rishi Sunak is now officially the UK's new Prime Minister. He's the third leader in just 7 weeks, and earlier on Tuesday he said, "I will unite the country, not with words but with actions," and had promised to fix mistakes by now former Prime Minister Liz Truss. Earlier he went to Buckingham Palace, where King Charles III formally appointed him Prime Minister, a short time after Liz Truss had also been to see the King to resign after 49 days in office. Well, Mr Sunak is the first person of colour to become Britain's head of government, and he's the youngest Prime Minister in more than 200 years. And so, as we were saying there, Rishi Sunak is now the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Let's go live to my colleague in Downing Street, Sean Lee.
Hello and welcome to audiences around the world who are joining us here in the UK, where the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has given a speech to the nation before making his way into number 10 as Prime Minister for the first time. Rishi Sunak, the man who was rejected just a short couple of months ago by members of the ruling Conservative Party who didn't want him and didn't accept his message that his rival Liz Truss's economic plans would wreck the public finances. Well, that was what came to pass one way or another. You can blame the market, you can blame, as Ms Truss herself did, trying to do too much too soon. You can blame Kwasi Kwarteng, the outgoing Chancellor of the Exchequer, putting forward a budget speech and not providing all the details of how they were going to provide the money that was going to finance the tax cuts. Nonetheless, as Rishi Sunak acknowledged, he was here to correct the mistakes of the recent past. He told the British audience, "I will unite the country, not with words, but with action." That will be easier said than done. He is the third Prime Minister in 7 weeks, but this morning he promised to fix the mistakes made by Liz Truss and, by implication, promised a government both of integrity and of achievement. And the implication was that that hadn't been the case of his predecessor but one, Boris Johnson. Now, not behind that famous door at the moment. He's begun work in his office in the House of Commons instead, well out of sight of the media, where he's been able to fire people and tell people he doesn't want them in the cabinet anymore. Then he will return to Downing Street, we expect some point this afternoon, perhaps slipping in quietly at the back, to begin the process of summoning people who are going to get jobs in the new cabinet. Some big name changes are expected, not least because of the vacancies we now know already exist. Chloe Smith has gone from Work and Pensions, and Jacob Rees-Mogg from the Business Department. Now, Reuters news agency is reporting that that job is going to go to Grant Shapps, who just a week ago returned to the cabinet as Home Secretary after Suella Braverman resigned. I'm terribly sorry if you're following it, difficult to keep up. There have been an awful lot of changes in British government personnel. Don't worry too much about the names or the details. Think only that he starts with a clean sheet. He was unanimously accepted as the candidate of the Conservative Parliamentary Party. He was the only person who got 100 nominations and put his name forward. So in a sense, he has the power and the authority now to do whatever he likes with the cabinet. The expectation, though, is that it will be a much broader-based cabinet than the one that was leaving office just a few hours ago. The one job I think we can be sure that he will not change is that of Chancellor of the Exchequer. Jeremy Hunt was appointed by Liz Truss to clean up the mess created by Kwasi Kwarteng's budget earlier last month. And all the impression is that that stability that the markets gained as a result of Jeremy Hunt arriving and him reversing most of the budget measures, it would be hard to put that at risk again by bringing somebody else into number 11. Now, the Conservatives have been in office one way or another since 2010, but for the first 5 years they were in office with another party, in a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. The leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey, was himself a cabinet minister in that coalition, and he joins us now. Sir Ed, thank you very much for being with us. I mean, the obvious question to ask you is, how do you think that the Conservative Party now under Rishi Sunak differs from the Conservative Party which you were able to cooperate with all the problems and difficulties that come in any coalition for 5 years? So Edward Davey, leader of the Liberal Democrats, thank you very much for joining us here on BBC News.
That was my colleague Sean Lee speaking there to Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats. Now stay with us here on Impact. We've got lots more of the international headlines coming up in the next few minutes. This is Impact on BBC World News. I'm Yalda Hakim. The UN's nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, says its inspectors have regularly visited two sites in Ukraine at the centre of Russian claims that Kyiv is preparing a so-called dirty bomb, explosives laced with nuclear material. It says the inspectors will return in the coming days following a Ukrainian request. Russia has not offered any evidence for its allegations, which NATO dismisses. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky warned it meant Russia itself could be preparing an attack of this kind. Well, I spoke to our correspondent in Kyiv, Hugo Bachega, who told us more. That's our correspondent Hugo Bachega reporting there from Kyiv. Well, Mariana Bujerin works on the project on managing the atom at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. She's currently in Boston and joins us live from there now. Thank you very much, Mariana, for joining us here on the program. Just help our audiences understand a little bit more about what this so-called dirty bomb is. We sort of only have 30 seconds left, but there is a lot of talk about a nuclear. Actually, no, I'm being told that this must be my last question. Mariana, thank you very much for bringing us up to date on the situation there and what this so-called dirty bomb is that the Russians keep talking about. You can, of course, learn more about the so-called dirty bomb. We have an explainer on our website, and we are bringing you up to date on the latest developments and situation both in Ukraine, but of course the news here in the United Kingdom about the new Prime Minister here in the UK. You can get all of that on our website. I'll be back in 30 minutes' time with all the latest headlines.
For the first time ever, television viewers in their homes would now be able to watch the crowning of their Queen as it happened.
Whenever we got another refusal from the government, out would come the banner headline, "Government still opposing BBC TVs," because we knew we were right. We knew the public not only wanted to see it, but deserved to see it.
The BBC was the fortress of British culture. You were allowed to make a film in any style you liked. It was my film school.
BBC children's programmes were deeply respected. If it had been on any other channel, it would not have had the same power.
The BBC has helped to define who we are. It's helped to define our identity.
One was able to do what I'm committed to do, which is to make films about real people and real people's lives.
You might say iconic is a bit of an overused word, but the BBC Marconi Type A literally is an icon. The basis of the symbol on most computers worldwide.
Hello, this is Impact. I'm Yalda Hakim. Rishi Sunak is now officially the UK's Prime Minister, the fifth in 6 years, and promises to restore stability after mistakes by his predecessor, Liz Truss.
I have been elected as leader of my party and your Prime Minister, in part, to fix them. And that work begins immediately.
Liz Truss leaves number 10 as the shortest-serving British Prime Minister ever, but defends her vision of lower taxes for the UK. She urged Rishi Sunak to be bold in a bid to boost the economy. We'll be live in Downing Street looking at the challenges facing the new Prime Minister. Also in the programme, the UN's nuclear watchdog says it will continue to monitor two sites at the centre of Russian claims that Ukraine is preparing a so-called dirty bomb. 5 Palestinians, reportedly all gunmen, have been killed in a major Israeli raid against a militant group in the occupied West Bank. That's all coming up here on Impact. Welcome back to the programme. Rishi Sunak is now officially the UK's new Prime Minister. He's the third leader in just 7 weeks, and earlier on Tuesday he said, "I will unite the country not with words but with action," and has promised to fix mistakes by now former Prime Minister Liz Truss. Let's go to my colleague Sean Lee, who joins us live now from Downing Street. Sean.
Hello and welcome to our viewers internationally and here in the UK to Downing Street, the heart of British government, where the Prime Minister has just returned to number 10 Downing Street behind me, and he is starting to make the appointments to his cabinet after sacking a third of his cabinet ministers or accepting the resignations from some of them, including the former Welsh Secretary Robert Buckland, who has said that he chose to resign, along apparently with the Business Secretary Jacob Rees-Mogg. A group of others, including the Education Secretary for England Kim Malthouse, were offered jobs in government but outside of the cabinet and chose not to accept them. These moves give the Prime Minister a lot of room to shape the cabinet he wants. One big question we want to find out this afternoon is whether he leaves in place his Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, the man who was brought in by Liz Truss to clear up the mess caused by that so-called mini budget that turned out to be perhaps the biggest and most dramatic budget Britain had seen for decades. Well, the Prime Minister has said that I will unite the country, not with words, but with actions. He is, of course, the third Conservative leader and Prime Minister in the space of 7 weeks, but he appeared in Downing Street this morning after accepting the invitation from the King to form a new administration. He promised to fix the mistakes made by his immediate predecessor, Liz Truss. Now, as I say, behind the famous front door, that black front door with the nameplate that says First Lord of the Treasury, which of course is ultimately the job that the Prime Minister has, the work begins, initially appointing the big names in the cabinet. Will he move his Home Secretary Grant Shapps, who was only appointed just last week when Suella Braverman resigned and condemned Liz Truss, the woman who had appointed her to the job barely a month before? Will he move James Cleverly, his Foreign Secretary, who has established himself over the last few months on the international stage? But will he want to give that plum posting to maybe a former colleague like Dominic Raab, who was once the Deputy Prime Minister? What of the existing Deputy Prime Minister and Health Secretary, Therese Coffey? She's not among the names of people who we have told had been asked to leave their jobs, not so far at least. But does that mean she's staying at Health? Does that mean she's staying as Deputy Prime Minister? Does it mean that the Prime Minister would choose to have a Deputy Prime Minister? He's not obliged to have one. All of these changes are things we will expect to find out in the next coming hours. And we will know because they're going to walk up Downing Street, the people who are either being moved in the Cabinet or promoted in the Cabinet or given jobs for the first time. We will see them as they come into number 10 behind me, and we'll do our best to get reaction to them. So worth staying with us on BBC News over the next couple of hours, at least, for all the comings and goings. We'll talk in a moment to our chief political correspondent, Nick Eardley, for an update. But earlier, Rishi Sunak went to Buckingham Palace, where King Charles formally appointed him Prime Minister a short time after Liz Truss, and also been to see the monarch to coin a phrase, surrender the office of Prime Minister after just 49 chaotic days in office. In a moment, Graham Satchell looks at how Rishi Sunak reached this moment in his life and career. But first, an update from our political correspondent, Arnie Wells. Now, it's worth reminding ourselves that the arrival of Rishi Sunak is a culmination of a relatively short political career at Westminster. Some people take 20 years to get to the top. John Major became an MP in 1979 and Prime Minister in 1990. Tony Blair entered the House of Commons in 1983 and only finally reached number 10 in 1997. And in the case of Tony Blair, he was only a last-minute candidate to be an MP in any case, because a boundary change has suddenly created a new seat and a vacancy, and he was in the position to fill it. Rishi Sunak, however, arrived first of all getting a plum seat, the seat vacated by the former Foreign Secretary William Hague in Richmond in North Yorkshire, and he became an MP in an election just 7 years ago. He's already in number 10 at the age of 42, making himself the youngest politician to pit the younger back in the 19th century. Graham Satchell reflects on this rapid rise to the top.
OK, that was news from here in the UK and Britain's new Prime Minister Rishi Sunak there, brought to you from Downing Street by my colleague Sean Lay. Now let's go to the rest of the day's news now. And the UN's nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, says its inspectors have regularly visited two sites in Ukraine at the centre of Russian claims that Kyiv is preparing a so-called dirty bomb, explosives laced with nuclear material. It says the inspectors will return in the coming days following a Ukrainian request. Russia has not offered any evidence for its allegations, which NATO dismisses. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky warned it meant Russia itself could be preparing an attack of this kind. Well, I spoke to our correspondent in Kyiv, Hugo Bachega, who told us more about this. That was our correspondent Hugo Bachega there reporting from Kiev. Stay with us here on Impact, still to come. New research commissioned by the BBC shows the dramatic impact the coronavirus pandemic had on mental health. This is Impact on BBC World News. I'm Yalda Hakim. 6 Palestinians have been killed by Israel's security forces in a raid in the occupied West Bank, 5 of them in the city of Nablus. Several of the dead belong to the militant group The Lion's Den. Israel says it acted after the killing of a soldier this month. Thousands have attended funerals of the Palestinians killed in raids. A spokesman for the Palestinian leadership called for international help over the mounting Israeli raids, which it called a war crime. Well, I spoke to Joel Greenberg from BBC Monitoring in Jerusalem to bring us up to date. That was Joe Greenberg reporting there from Jerusalem. Now, a global poll commissioned by BBC shows the profound and diverse effect that the pandemic has had on mental health. A third of people polled in 30 countries reported that they had lost a close loved one during the pandemic, and nearly half said they were financially worse off. But just over 1 in 3 said they had experienced an improvement in their sense of well-being. The BBC's population correspondent Stephanie Hegarty reports from Vietnam. And you can see more of Stephanie's report. You can find a link to the full results for that pandemic poll at the usual place, bbc.com/news. Now, military and UN experts have told a BBC investigation they believe Russian forces deliberately cut off the water supply to the Ukrainian town of Mykolaiv in April. The southern coastal city had been without clean drinking water for about 6 months, forcing residents to line up at temporary water stations. Satellite imagery and data suggests the pipeline to the city was deliberately destroyed while under Russian control. Destroying resources vital for civilian life can be regarded as a violation of international humanitarian law. Now let's return to our top story. The fact that Rishi Sunak entered number 10 today as Britain's third Prime Minister in 7 weeks highlights the period of extreme political and economic turbulence the UK has been living through. But what do the voters around the country make of the extraordinary events we've been witnessing at Westminster? Our correspondent Fiona Trott has more. Well, as you've been hearing, Rishi Sunak is now officially the UK's new Prime Minister. He's the third leader in just 7 weeks, and earlier on Tuesday he said, "I will unite the country, not with words but with action," and has promised to fix mistakes by now former Prime Minister Liz Truss. Let's go to my colleague Sean Lay now, who joins us from Downing Street.
So one very quick question, finally, pick up the phone to Nicola Sturgeon. That would be your first bit of advice, yeah?
I think so. I think the way Liz Truss behaved in terms of the First Minister was diabolical, to be brutally honest. I hope he behaves in a far more grown-up way. Pick up the phone, have the discussions of those matters where we can work together, respect Scottish democracy, and let's move on.
Stuart Hosey, MP for Dundee East, thank you very much for joining us here on BBC News. Welcome now to viewers from around the world who've rejoined us as we stand here in Downing Street. We are waiting for the big black door to open and admit some of the faces who are being promoted or introduced for the first time around the cabinet table. Just to bring you up to date, the Prime Minister has let go a third of his cabinet, or the third of the cabinet he would have inherited from Liz Truss. All of their jobs are up for grabs, of course, as the new Prime Minister. A third of them have either gone voluntarily or been told they're no longer welcome, or offered a demotion outside of cabinet which they've chosen not to take. The question now is what the challenges will be facing the Prime Minister on the world stage. John Camphor is the Executive Director of the UK in the World initiative at Chatham House, the think tank focusing on international affairs. John Camphor, welcome. that question of where the UK is in the world post-Brexit has been one vexing both the Conservative occupants of the building behind me and many else in Britain. Is it clear the sort of path that Rishi Sunak is able to navigate, particularly one in the grip of an economic crisis? John Kampfner at the UK and the World Initiative at Chatham House, thank you very much. Right, let's hear now from a Conservative MP. Laura Trott joins us from College Green, just outside the Palace of Westminster. Laura Trott, thank you very much for being with us. You represent Sevenoaks in Kent. For those who don't know the geography of the United Kingdom, this is in the southeast of England. The political geography is that Sevenoaks has been, for a long, long time, certainly as long as I can remember, probably for longer, a rock-solid, safe Tory seat. Yours is the sort of constituency that a Prime Minister can rely on for support. Laura Trott, we'll leave it there. I'm sorry you've been fighting both sirens and helicopters. I think it's probably a price of being out and about on the day of transition in Downing Street. For now, thank you very much. Laura Trott there, Conservative MP for Sevenoaks in Kent in the southeast of England. Return now to our chief political correspondent, Nick Eardley. We heard different views there from Stuart Hosey, of course, the opposition. There should be an election. If there's not going to be an election, at least pick up the phone to Nicola Sturgeon. I mean, that's one small little thing that could send a slightly different signal, couldn't it? It's a simple thing if he made a phone call to the First Minister of Scotland, even if it's just a courtesy call, to say nothing at all of substance. I know you're going to keep an eye on the road and the door. Well, I talk to somebody else for now. Let's speak to Charlotte Ivers, who is the an author and of course an economist herself. Charlotte is a columnist in the Sunday Times. She also writes for the New Statesman. Charlotte, she also works as Times Radio political correspondent. Goodness me, Charlotte, you're busy. And thank you for making time to talk to us. Talk about the economic challenges he faces. How significant are they? Charlotte Ivers, we're going to leave it there. We've got some more news from Nick Eardley, our chief political correspondent.
Jeremy Hunt has been reappointed Chancellor, as expected.
Sigh of relief from the markets.
That was what we were expecting, that he would keep that job. No sign of him yet.
So we know that Dominic Raab is not Chancellor then?
Yes, that's right.
Process elimination.
Correct.
Elementary, my dear Holmes.
Jeremy Hunt, a tweet just come out on number 10 Downing Street's Twitter saying the Right Honourable Jeremy Hunt MP has been reappointed Chancellor of the Exchequer. I think that they've been told to do that probably because we saw Rishi Sunak trying to be a bit sombre and sober when he arrived. It feels to me like this government wants to be seen.
Well, neither of us are going to get jobs
Oliver
in that
Dowden,
respect.
a big ally
now
of
this
Rishi
is an
Sunak,
important return, isn't
somebody who ran his campaign over the summer, coming up now. Looks
Welcome
like
back to Downing Street, Mr. Dowden.
A senior job. You're going to be Home Secretary, Mr. Dowden? Is it a senior job?
Now, the fascinating thing I remember, Nick, as you will, was Oliver Dowden was the party chairman who resigned over the Tiverton by-election defeat.
I was there.
You were there. We were. Happy days. Gosh, we wouldn't have imagined the summer was going to turn out as it did, would we? Or that we would be on to our second
Two Prime Ministers ago now.
That by-election was only back in the summer. We're going to say goodbye. I'm going to pick up this thought with you about Oliver Dowden. So we have significant appointments to the new cabinet of Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Do stay with us on BBC News. But for now, we say goodbye to our viewers around the world.